Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rob and welcome to another episode of Let's Draw. In this episode we'll be drawing Yrel from Warlords of Draenor, the latest X-Pack to World of Warcraft. Now, yet again, I'll be showing a different workflow in this video. So as you can see, things are already slightly different. I've got a 50% gray canvas, and then I'm starting the basic pencil sketch. Very quickly roughing out my basic shapes, just trying to get the general composition hammered out. Staying very loose, not really worrying too much about being very precise at this stage, just really want to get the major idea out. So I'm going for a very dramatic shot. I've got War Chief Blackhand in the foreground here, not fully in frame. I want to leave a little bit of mystery, a little bit of drama in the shot, so really the only thing that's framed is his weapon and of course his armored black hand. Opposite him I've got Yrel, and I want to have her holding that very famous mace that we first saw in Burning Crusade. She's wielding it, but of course she's not. It's not her weapon, so she's not very comfortable with it, so she's kind of hefting it a little bit, and I wanted to communicate that in her overall gesture, her overall pose. So a lot of her weight's going to be placed on her far leg. And you can see that right now, just in the general, very quick skeleton that I put down. But I'll refine that a bit more. So I've added a slight vignetting. Just at this stage even, I'm trying to get the overall attention onto Yrel on the right there. So the way I'm doing that primarily is going to be with light and shadow. She'll be the lightest values. She'll be basically the massing of the lightest values in the painting. And conversely, War Chief Blackhand will be the massing of the darkest values. And when I say that, what I'm talking about is the lightest part of War Chief Blackhand will not be any brighter than the darkest part of Yrel. And that idea is called massing. You want to do this so that there's no confusion in the viewer's eye about what thing they should be focusing on. It should be very clear just on the very first glance of the image. So there I'm adjusting Yrel's sketch just a little bit, getting the pose to have more heft on her right foot. And now I'm blocking in the basic shapes. See, this is different from what I normally do. It's different even from what I've done within the same painting. With War Chief Blackhand, I did an overall outline, sketched that out, and then filled in my values. But with Yrel, she's wearing very complicated armor, so I would actually lose a lot of time focusing on all of the small details, all of these small outlines, only to have to paint over it yet again. So as a time-saving measure, I'm just blocking out her basic form with my darkest value and working around that. So as you can see, I've started doing the facial features, things like that, going into a bit more detail, just slowly refining, sort of carving away at the overall shape. When you use this kind of technique, you have to have a very clear image in your head of what you're actually painting. It's very difficult to do this, to just paint freely without an underlying sketch if you can't envision it. The pencil sketch allows you to work out all of your forms, all of your shapes, your perspective, your foreshortening, your anatomy. It lets you do all of that basic work before you even start painting. That way when you're painting, you can not worry about all these trivial little things, and you're able to focus simply on your colors, where your light's coming from, your reflected lights, things like that. With this technique, you don't have that. You're thinking about all of these things at once. So it's very difficult if you don't have a clear image in your head. So I can't really recommend it if you're just starting out, with digital art especially, but I just want to demonstrate it here because it may be something good to have in your tool bag. So I'm just working now with temporary layers. I'm creating layers on top of what I've accepted, what I've considered, finished and okay. And I'm doing that so that I'm non-destructively working. That way, if I make a stray mark or something, I'm not having to rework all of this work that I've just finished. But as you can see, whenever I'm satisfied with that temporary layer, merge it down. So that way I'm keeping the number of layers as low as possible. You want to keep it to as close to a single layer as you possibly can. You definitely don't want to go above, say, 3 or 4 layers total active at any one time. Now here I'm adjusting the position of Blackhand's weapon because I want to give it a good read. I want to create a sort of line of movement back up toward Yrel's face. Because Yrel, again, she is our major focal point. She's the main thing that the viewer should be led back to in this painting. Now the position of the weapon is curving up because Warchief Blackhand's body curves all the way down. So as the viewer glances around the painting, their eye should follow that curve, and the weapon is there as a sort of ramp almost. If you can imagine, their eyes are just skateboarding around the page. That angle of the weapon should bring them back up to Yrel's face. I'm jumping around quite a bit because I'm noticing things as I'm working, and I just have to correct there. I don't want to forget it later on. So now I'm starting to block in the armor, and much like the body, you just want to work in just the basic shape, the basic outline, the silhouette of the armor. Don't focus too much on the details. Don't concern yourself with that just yet. Just worry about the overall impression, the shape of it. You want to start with simple forms first and then work your way down. If you just try to paint, and I see a lot of beginners do this, if you try to paint all of the details at once, if you paint it as you imagine the final image to be from the beginning, you'll never finish. It's too much to try and think of. It's too much to try and keep straight in your head. Work with simplified shapes, simplified forms, so that your brain only has to consider the primary lights, the secondary reflections on things that are simple, on things that are less complicated, so that you're not having to think, oh, okay, well, there's a bounce light here, but because this thing curves a little bit more, that means there's less on this part, more on that. It's too much to think of. You really want to reduce things down as much as possible to your basic forms: cubes, spheres, cylinders. That's why in any introductory art class, this is the first thing they try and teach you to render. Draw a sphere with a single light on it. Draw a cube with a single light on it. Now imagine the shadow. Figure out the light fall off on this sphere. Things like that. That's why you do these practice sessions over and over and over. Because that never goes away. No matter how complicated something may seem, it can always be reduced down to a collection of these simplified basic forms: a sphere, a cube, or a cylinder. And that's all that I'm doing here. When I'm thinking through and imagining what all of the lighting would be, I'm not thinking of it as, oh, it's this curved shoulder guard that has this kind of flare on the end. I'm not thinking of all that. I'm simply thinking, okay, it's basically a cube. Or, yeah, okay, this part is basically a cylinder. Like, you don't want to consider too many things. You'll just confuse yourself, and at worst, you'll paralyze yourself considering so many different possibilities and factors and things like that. It's too much work. So simplify, simplify, simplify. Now the nice thing about working in Grayscale is that you don't have to think very much about your colors and their relative intensities and hues and things like that. You're just working flat out in value, which makes it really, really simple. All you have to do is think about, okay, this is twice as dark as this part, which is one step brighter than this part, things like that. So you really only have to work with a collection of like maybe 3 or 4 or 5 basic colors and then just blend between them. That's why this part is coming out so quickly. And that's what makes this technique so powerful. You're really just worrying about your values. You don't have to think too much about all these other factors that can change your perception of a color and try to work around that and adjust the lighting for the effects that, complementary colors might have. And you don't have to think about any of that. You're just working straight up, okay, the light does this, so it's gonna make this part that much brighter, etc., etc. Like, if you look carefully, you can see that really I'm just sampling the same 3 or 4 parts that I've already painted down at the very beginning, and I'm just working off of that. When I need to pick up a color, I'm not going to my color selector or going up to the color wheel and switching things around or anything like that. I'm just picking it up from the canvas on her shoulder pads, things like that. Colors that are already established. So it's kind of nice because it allows you to just pick a value range and work with that. You're only ever really thinking about how light reacts on a surface. You're not thinking about, oh, well, wait a minute, this part is a little bit warmer, okay, this part's a little bit cooler. You don't have to think about any of that. There are drawbacks to this technique, but for the most part, it's fairly useful, especially when you're working on a very intricate piece or something that's very, very complicated. In this case, it's just very intricate. Much, much easier to work like this than to have to consider colors and hues and intensities at the same time as I'm trying to create all these overlapping armor pads and things like that. It would have been way, way too much to consider. Especially trying to do it quickly, as images for this video series need to be done. It would have been very, very tempting to not paint all of the scale mail, to just simply use a pattern brush or something like that, or fill it with a basic noise texture or something like that I've picked up. But when you take shortcuts, it's going to be obvious. Anytime you take a shortcut, it will be obvious. Maybe not to everyone, but certainly someone who views your work, a percentage of people who look at it will notice. So it's better, even though it's tedious, to take the time and actually flesh out all of these small details if they are absolutely necessary. And in this case, I mean, it's large enough, it makes a big enough difference in the overall impression of the image that yes, it's necessary. So as boring as it is to watch me paint this scale mail, it's absolutely necessary. It's a requirement for the image. It had to be done. Now because her arm and hand kind of overlap this very intricate and existing part, like her breastplate, I've decided to paint that on a separate layer all of its own, and then I'll collapse that back down into the rest of the stuff. But keeping this on a separate layer allows me to carve away, as you saw, the extraneous bits of the paint without having to worry about reworking what was below it. This comes in super handy when I'm painting her fingers. So had I not painted that hand on a separate layer, when it came time to adjust the positioning so that her wrist is flexed more upward, that would have been a ridiculous amount of time spent redoing the bits of her breastplate. But by keeping it on a separate temporary layer, I was able to buy myself quite a bit of time. So yes, you get less of a painterly look the more layers that you use, but temporary layers are fairly handy for situations where you're not quite sure, especially when you're drawing from imagination. You're never really going to be sure, right, until you paint it out. But just don't get careless with it. Don't create 1,000 layers. I've seen actual documents with somewhere upwards of 35 layers, and it's mind-boggling. You destroy your computer's performance the more layers you create, and at that point, I mean, 35 layers. How can you even keep track of what each layer has? So when you're happy with it, collapse it down. Now you might think that painting very complicated armor is not fun, but honestly there's just something very comforting about working on really rigid and well-defined shapes like this. I found myself having a lot of fun with this painting, especially after I've gotten most of it established and I figured out the overall composition. Now at this point, it was just really fun to work on. Now I don't know if you saw it, but when you're painting things that need to line up, and especially in this case, like the sash, it needed to make a plumb line from her belt buckle down, pointing toward the ground, because gravity would pull it straight down. She's not in motion in any particular direction that the viewer can tell. So having that sash be really flappy or in motion would have been kind of awkward and forced looking. So it had to be a plumb line. But that's difficult to envision when you're trying to paint the entire shape. So what I did there was just at the very tip of the sash, where I wanted the tip to be, I just made a quick dot. I just eyeballed it from the belt buckle to about where I expect the plumb line to end, put a dot, and I use that dot to guide the rest of the shape. It's sort of the same shortcut that you've seen me use in previous videos for aligning things like the eyes. I'll make a dot at the corner, the inside corner of each eye, and I'll make another dot at the outside corner of each eye, and then draw the eyes in between, the upper and lower lids. Doing it that way keeps you from making alignment mistakes and things like that. Things that you would not have noticed maybe while you're actually working on the particulars. And then you have to go back, erase it. Oh man, I messed up, paint again. But yeah, something as simple as painting a dot can save you just a few minutes here and there. I mean, not that you need to rush through your work, and not that... Now, I'm not advocating that you shouldn't spend as much time as a piece demands. No, by all means, you need to sit there and do it, and just keep working until you're satisfied and everything looks good, and just commit as much of the time as the piece needs to get things done. But what I am saying is that you want to do this efficiently. You don't want to just sit there and spin your wheels grinding away on something when you could have saved yourself a few minutes here and there that would eventually amortize over time to become a huge savings, a couple hours, a couple days in some cases. So you want to work efficiently, but not in a rush, if that makes any sense. I mean, I forget which movie it was, but maybe it was The Shining, but Stanley Kubrick sat there and did, for one particular scene, over 120 takes. Jackie Chan's notorious for doing that, well, back in the heyday. I mean, now he's not doing much of anything, but age will do that. But no, Jackie Chan would take a month to do a single stunt in one scene that would appear for maybe 15 seconds or less in the film. And he would do this because it's that commitment to quality. It's the commitment to putting in the time that even the most minute parts of your painting, or in his case film, would require to get across the best that you possibly can create. Because when somebody evaluates your work, they're not thinking about the circumstance behind the creation of the work. They're not like, oh, well, he had a midterm the following week, so he needed to study. Or they're not thinking, oh, well, Sally she was sick that week, so she had the sniffles. She didn't want to spend too much more time on this painting. Nobody says that. All they look at is the final work, and it's an evaluation of whether or not it was good. That's it. No one cares how much time you spent. No one cares how little time you spent. I've seen, people, they're like, oh, look at this painting. Look at this drawing. I did it in 45 minutes. Isn't that cool? No, it's not cool, because that's not the best that you could have done. The fact that you have to qualify it with a time limit sort of detracts from its overall value, don't you think? So, no. Put in the effort. Really spend the time. Work until you are satisfied. Work until you're able to say, yes, this is what I can do. So, I don't know how I got on that tangent, but yeah, just put in the effort, Commit yourself to doing the best that you can on every piece that you can. And sometimes, yeah, you have to turn it in, I mean, there are things like deadlines and due dates and client demands and things like that. YouTube schedules. But push yourself. just push as much as you can. And if you can't make it, well, then it was out of your hands. Circumstances demanded otherwise. But don't let laziness, don't let things that you can control get in the way of your art. Really put in the work. It'll be painful at the time. You'll be exhausted, you know, many late nights, things like that. But hey, past those late nights, well into several years down the road, you'll be able to look at something you've produced, a piece that you painted, and think to yourself, man, you know, I'm a better artist now than I was then, but I'm still really proud of this. And just a side note here, Orcish anatomy is really, really hard. If you look at the orcs in the game, they aren't really, really cartoony, to the point of being almost a caricature of muscle-bound people. Really, really massive deltoids, about the size of their chests almost, to support those massive shoulder armors that they can get, I guess, I don't know. So I had to rework the arm several times there, as you saw, and in fact it's made even more complicated by the fact that there's some really dramatic foreshortening happening here, plus had to make room for the massive pectoral muscles that kind of are slightly in frame, things like that. And that's sort of the problem you'll run into with this technique when you're just working straight through, not really doing a proper sketch. But you can get around it. It's just a little bit more trial and error, that sort of thing. At this point, really, I'm just cleaning up the foreground stuff. Warchief Blackhand is fairly well established here, so not much work left to do. Just had to work out a few of the details, though. There's not, or at least I couldn't find too much reference for the particulars of his black hand. So I assumed that the plates on his glove were something that could actually be constructed. And historically, gloves like that, the plates were actually bolted into the leather of the glove. So they were slightly curved, but they didn't do more than cover the tops of the fingers. And it was mostly just to protect against swords. So that's the assumption I made here with Blackhand. Now this particular scene actually does happen in the game. It happens on Blackhand's ship, and I thought about perhaps adding in a mast, and then I thought, well, maybe I could create some Grand-style clouds, maybe to add a little bit more dynamism to the scene, but it really just complicated the read, the way your eye moves through the scene, so I decided against it. Instead went with sparklies. Because nothing says Paladin like really bright lights. So now that I've completed the values as much as I liked, I'm working on a new layer now set to color mode, and I'm just filling in the colors now. Now this is a little, if you haven't done it before, it's a little bit tricky because you'll pick a color, but it'll have its own value associated with that sort of affects your perception of its color. So the first few times you use this technique, it may not feel intuitive, it might even seem wrong, You might think, oh, well, that's not the color I picked. No, that is the color you picked. It's just your eye is perceiving it differently because it has a different value on the color wheel that you picked. But when you're painting on a layer that is set to color mode, it completely disregards the value information and uses just the color information, just that hue. So, yeah, it's something to keep in mind. It's a gotcha that could completely throw off your expectations. It's a little jarring the first few times, but after you've used it in a few pieces, you'll start to get a really intuitive feel. Now my special effects layers, adding in glows everywhere. My cinematic lens flare. And collapse down my layers. Final adjustments and tuning. Now I've duplicated the layer, blurred it, and now I'm erasing away the parts that are in focus. This is a technique you've seen me do ever since, I think, the second video. And that's purely a personal preference thing. I like the way that it draws the attention back to the focal point.